When I was in seminary, we used to have this running gag that if someone before service stood up and started to pray, Lord, you always said whenever two or three are gathered, we kind of knew the congregation was sparse on the ground. And like so many other things, when you're reading it out of context in the Bible, you miss so much of the richness of what's actually going on. Those words are found in all the synoptic gospels. And in Matthew, what we're encountering this week with chapter 18, we've already done the pivot. So we're already working towards Jerusalem. Jesus has already told them what's going to happen. They already don't want to hear it. But they're still there. They're sticking it out for the most part. And Jesus has just gone through a large session of teaching in parallels about what community inclusion looks like. And now he's talking about the actual community church. Now, this is one of those times where we have to keep Jesus' time in the first century, plus Matthew's time in the later part of the first century, plus our time in the 21st century, all lined up, because so much of this passage is actually about Matthew's church in the later part of the century as opposed to Jesus' followers in the early part of the century. You know how you like a television character until you decide you've seen enough and realize they're really not that enjoyable? Or you start a friendship or a new romance and everything is wonderful. We call it the honeymoon period for a reason. And then suddenly they're not so enjoyable. You learn things about them you didn't think you'd know. Well, it's the same with any relationship, same with any community. Those first blush of engagement and acceptance are so wonderful and they're so inclusive. And everybody's in such a joyful place. But it's got to move on. It can't stay in that bubble of assumed perfection. People's personalities kick in. Their level of energy, their other extra needs, their other responsibilities, they all kick in and they start to inform the relationship you have. Jesus knew that. I mean, the man was an adult. He'd lived quite a long time before he was starting his preaching career. And Matthew's church was certainly very, very well aware of that. They'd been together 80 years at this point in time. And they had growing pains. They had arguments. They had separations. They had no gospel to fall on at that point in time. That's why Matthew, the writer of Matthew and the writer of all the other gospels, stepped in and put something on paper. Up until that time, it had all just been talk. This is the problem that we have in so many communities, including our own today. And putting it in Jesus' words and lessons Jesus probably did teach, it's easier to understand that Jesus foresaw so many of these problems that we have today. Getting along, accepting each other, letting all of our differences be in the same place. Being in community is hard. If you've ever lived in a communal situation, there's all this navigation: who cooks, who shops, who cleans. And you quickly discover that if you don't love the person you're living with, it's a lot harder to kind of find that middle ground. So Jesus was giving some basic instruction about how to form that community so that you could keep growing forward and you wouldn't just fall apart over arguments and disinterest and dislikes. So he gave this advice, and it was picked up by the writer of Matthew almost 100 years later, put into the context of, okay, this is where we as a church, as an ecclesia, not the building, the people, have to figure this out. So it's a very simple principle. If you have a disagreement with someone, you go talk it out. If they're not going to listen, or no agreement can be reached, then you bring a third party in, one that you both trust, one that you both will talk to. We today would call that a mediator. If that still will not resolve your conflict, then bring it to the wider community. And it now becomes the community's issue. You have allowed someone else to step in and make choices, and now you have to live with them. It's a great process of reconciliation, but there's a few things historically we need to put into context. We in the 21st century have a real sense of individuality, that what happens to us is our business, we don't share it if we don't want to, and no one else has the right to it. That's not the attitude they had in the first century. In the first century, everybody shared everything: the good, the bad, the painful, the gossip, the half truths, the honesty. Everything was shared. In fact, if you go forward and look into Acts, they even took that further, that they shared their housing, they shared their wealth, they shared their meals. Everything was shared. There was nothing that was left to the individual. And that got the early church into trouble. But it was following the ideal. It was in that honeymoon stage where everybody would naturally come together and everybody would naturally be on the same page because, of course, we all love Jesus and we all love the message and we're all committed followers. It's just never that simple. In the first century, there was two types of sin. There was sin against God, and there was sin against humans. The sin against humans was considered the most significant. You could work it out with God at any point in time, but to work it out with another human took a lot of effort and a lot of agreement and a lot of conversation. And so the church, the community, the people were encouraged to do that work, to go and talk to each other. And there's no outlining what these conflicts were. They could be as simple as you stole my veil to as complex as you stole my husband. I mean, they're people. They were real people with real issues and real pains. And when you get a group of vulnerable people in there, no matter what ideology, what belief system is holding them together, real life will intervene. And so we have this method of going and talking to each other. And then if that doesn't work, bring in a mediator. And if that doesn't work, and the entire community is now involved anyway, because remember, there are no boundaries in this community. There's really kind of no boundaries in our communities either. We just pretend there are. But once everybody was involved, it was not your problem alone anymore. You not only had to look for reconciliation with the person with whom you were in an argument, but you had to look for agreement and acceptance from the community around you. And what if they didn't agree with you? What if you were the one that was wrong? What if you were the one that had to grow, not the person that you thought was the problem? Now, this kind of power, and it is power, can become very dangerous. That we see plenty of times in the modern church. We see people who are absolutely convinced they know the right way to do things, and they interfere with other people's lives. People who didn't even realize they might have known something or thought they would at least mind their own business a little bit. So there's that privacy thing again that we assume. People who take on the authority to go and insert themselves into other people's existence. That was not what Jesus was talking about. With power, corruption comes very easily. So we have to watch ourselves. This is like a couple of other lines in addition to what the gospel is actually telling us, is that if you have a qualm, or you think you know of a qualm, or you think you know of the answer, don't necessarily assume you're the one that can make it better, because someone else might have other perspectives that might need to have an equal hearing. You might learn that you completely overstepped and misunderstood. You might learn that, the community is not looking on you as favorably as you think they are. These are very painful things, and we have to be very cautious that they can come up anytime a community talks to each other. But it's vital that we do have that conversation, and we have it in the Spirit of Christ. And that's another rough one. If we've got certain people in our communities that define what the Spirit of Christ is, and others who are not actually on board with that interpretation, then you've got a whole other falling apart there that needs to be worked on. Again, Matthew's community, Jesus would have been well aware of this. This is just people being people. And then it becomes the whole community's issue. They knew they were a minority. It wouldn't take anything to pull them apart. And part of their collective growth was dependent on everybody supporting each other, especially during the few periods where there were persecutions going on. If you could not trust your community, you could all be killed or exiled, or who knows what can happen. So you had to have that base of trust. And that base of trust could be threatened by dispute. And if you didn't face it, if you let it fester or hide in the background, it only got bigger. They knew that. Jesus knew that. And this was his method to sort it out, to talk it out. And then he tells the congregation, when you have come to the agreement, rest assured God is in that. What you bind together is the language used in the NRSV. What you bind together is what God will accept, because God is already there. If you do not accept it, then treat them like the Gentiles and the tax collectors. But wait, the Gentiles and the tax collectors had a special place in God's heart as people who we had to mission on to. So we are not talking about casting people all the way out and that you'll never have a relationship again. It is once the community has decided that person A is not in the best interest of the community, is not living diligently, is not honoring their commitment to community for whatever reason, and they are cast out, then a special level of attention is given to them to try to bring them back in another way. No one is lost in our community. No one is cast out and that's all there is to it. There's always an option to bring you back in. And within that, then we hear the promise that wherever two or more are gathered in agreement, in worship, in conversation, God is there. God is in our relationships, all of them, no matter what conflicts we have, no matter what superficial agreements seem to be going on, God is in there. And the other part of that, the more conflict you have, the more conflict you work through, the stronger the community, the stronger the reason you have to support each other. There's a win-win here, as long as we're prepared to face challenges and not just swipe them under the cloth. Because so many people just want to avoid that level of conflict. And we have right here lessons from Jesus, lessons from the writer of Matthew, that we cannot avoid that conflict. We cannot sweep it aside and pretend it doesn't exist, because ultimately it will fester and it will make the entire community sick. We don't have to think too hard about examples like that. So if you are in conflict with someone, try to resolve it. And know that that resolve might actually be just forgiving them and walking away. That's resolution. But whatever it is, find a place of peace, because it's far easier to be in connection with God when we are in connection with each other.